At precisely 1:15 hours on the 6th day of June, 1944, Major Friedrich von Dye stood by the window of his command post, situated near Carentan, his attention captured by a sound that sent a chill through him. The skies above the Cotentin Peninsula were alive with the insistent hum of aircraft engines, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them. This overwhelming sonic presence emanated from all directions, a deep mechanical roar that seemed to consume the very fabric of the night. Von Dye, a seasoned soldier, had experienced combat previously, having parachuted into Crete in 1941, fought in North Africa with the Ramki Brigade, and witnessed brutal engagements on the Eastern Front. Yet, nothing in his prior experiences could have prepared him for the unprecedented event about to unfold. Within the ensuing 3 hours, more than 13,000 American paratroopers would descend from that dark expanse. They would land in fields, submerged marshlands, atop rooftops, amongst the branches of trees, and directly within the heart of German defenses. Their arrival would be fragmented, disorganized, with many lacking their essential armaments. This unexpected influx would instill a level of fear within the Wehrmacht that no military strategist had foreseen. What von Dye, and indeed no German officer, could have possibly anticipated was that the very disarray inherent in this airborne onslaught would ultimately serve as its most potent weapon. The American forces were not descending in orderly formations. They were landing everywhere. The simple word "everywhere" would recur with alarming frequency in German reports, personal journals, and interrogation transcripts throughout the subsequent weeks. German officers who survived the Normandy campaign would later recount their encounters with these paratroopers with a sense of profound astonishment, some with palpable fear, and a select few with a grudging admiration typically reserved for adversaries who have unequivocally earned it. This narrative explores how American paratroopers, through sheer audacity, ingenuity, and an unyielding aggressive spirit, fundamentally redefined psychological warfare, completely blindsiding the formidable German military machine. The German army in 1944 stood as arguably the most professional fighting force globally, its officer corps steeped in a military tradition tracing back to Frederick the Great. German doctrine championed meticulous planning, precise coordination, and the methodical application of overwhelming force at critical junctures. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in 27 days, and France had capitulated in 6 weeks, its military apparatus sweeping across Europe with an almost inhuman precision. However, a critical vulnerability lay concealed within this very strength. German military thinking was predicated on a deep understanding of the enemy, their location, their intentions, and their methods. German officers were trained to perceive the battlefield as a grand chessboard, anticipating every move, calculating every counter, and maintaining absolute control. The American paratroopers who landed in Normandy irrevocably shattered this rigid paradigm, not through superior training or armaments, but by accomplishing something the German command structure simply could not fathom. They fought effectively amidst total chaos. On the night of June 5th, the German military command structure exemplified rigid organization. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, was not even in France. He had traveled to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, firmly convinced that the weather conditions rendered an Allied invasion an impossibility. General Oberst, Colonel General Lothar Rendulic, commander of the 91st Luftlande Division, a unit specifically trained to counter airborne assaults, was en route to Rennes for a war game. On the very night when his specialized training would have been most critical, Rendulic was traversing the Norman countryside in his staff car. At approximately 4:30 hours, Rendulic heard the aircraft overhead and instantly understood the unfolding situation. He ordered his driver to turn back and race to his headquarters at the Château de Bernaville, near Picauville. However, he never reached his destination. A small contingent of American paratroopers from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, had landed near the chateau and established an ambush on the road leading to the headquarters. As Rendulic's staff car approached, the Americans opened fire. First Lieutenant Malcolm Brune, a 24-year-old officer from Headquarters Company, 3rd Battalion, fatally shot General Rendulic as he attempted to exit the vehicle. Rendulic became the first German general to perish in the Normandy invasion, killed mere hours after the initial parachute drops, before he could issue a single order or orchestrate any coherent defense against the American attack. The impact of Rendulic's demise reverberated through the German command hierarchy. The 91st Division, specifically positioned to counter airborne operations, found itself without leadership at the most pivotal moment. This was but one casualty among many. Across the entire Cotentin Peninsula, German officers were being killed, captured, or isolated from their units. The chain of command was disintegrating even before the beach landings commenced. The American airborne operation had been designed with specific strategic objectives. The 82nd Airborne Division was tasked with capturing the town of Sainte-Mère-Église and securing vital crossings over the Murderette River. The 101st Airborne Division's mission was to seize the causeways leading inland from Utah Beach and to impede any German reinforcements attempting to reach the landing zones. These were clear, logical objectives, but their execution encountered immediate and severe complications. Cloud cover over the peninsula forced transport pilots to either ascend or descend sharply to avoid mid-air collisions, and German anti-aircraft fire further fragmented the formations. Pilots, many of whom were on their first combat missions, released their paratroopers prematurely, belatedly, or simply at random locations amidst the growing confusion and panic. The outcome was a catastrophic dispersion. Paratroopers who were intended to land together found themselves isolated, and units meant to regroup at specific assembly points were scattered across hundreds of square miles of Norman countryside. The statistical data was stark. Of the 6,928 men of the 101st Airborne Division who jumped that night, only 1 in 6 landed in their designated drop zones. The 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne experienced the most significant scattering, with merely 25% of its personnel landing within a mile of their intended objectives. After 24 hours of combat, the 101st Airborne could account for only 2,500 of its original 6,000 men under division command. The remainder were dispersed, captured, wounded, or deceased. Private First Class Bob Nobles of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment landed in a farmer's field with no sense of his location. Gunfire echoed from all directions. He had lost most of his equipment during the jump. His first encounter with another American soldier came when someone emerged from the darkness shouting, "Do not shoot! Do not shoot! I am from Cuco, Indiana. I forgot the password." Nobles found himself laughing. In the midst of German-occupied France, surrounded by enemy soldiers and uncertain of surviving the night, he laughed. This moment encapsulated the essence of the American paratrooper. Not a disciplined automaton executing a flawless plan, but a human being improvising, adapting, and refusing to be paralyzed by fear or disorientation. For the German defenders, this scattered nightmare was utterly incomprehensible. German military doctrine presupposed that an airborne assault would target specific objectives. Defenders were expected to identify drop zones, ascertain enemy intentions, and concentrate their forces to annihilate the paratrooper landing before it could establish a foothold. But how does one concentrate forces against an enemy who is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere? How does one pinpoint drop zones when paratroopers are descending into every field, every marsh, every village for miles in every conceivable direction? The German response fractured almost instantaneously. Local commanders were forced to confront threats materializing in their immediate vicinity. They could not await orders from higher command, because higher command lacked any clear understanding of the unfolding events. Telephone lines had been severed. Couriers were ambushed. Radio communications were choked with a cacophony of confused and contradictory reports. General Major General Otto Karl Wilhelm von Schlieb, commander of the 709th Infantry Division, had been attending the Rennes war game when the invasion commenced. He rushed back to discover his division in a state of utter disarray. In his post-war account for the United States Army Historical Division, von Schlieb recounted that by June 7th, his regiment was no longer capable of even capturing Sainte-Mère-Église, let alone defending it against the relentless fire of enemy naval guns and tanks. He personally had to rally retreating troops to prevent what he described as the onset of a panic triggered by enemy armor. The German General Staff possessed a term for such situations: Kriegsnebel, the fog of war. However, this was a fog unlike any they had previously encountered. It was not merely confusion regarding enemy movements. It was an absolute uncertainty about the fundamental nature of the threat. Were these paratroopers the main assault or a diversionary tactic? Were there thousands of them, or tens of thousands? Were they targeting Cherbourg or Carentan, or some objective yet to reveal itself? In the absence of clear intelligence, German commanders hesitated, and in warfare, hesitation often proves fatal. The 7th Army Headquarters received its initial reports of parachute landings at approximately 1:30 hours. General Friedrich Dollmann, the Army commander, was in Rennes attending the same war game that had drawn so many senior officers away from their posts. He did not return to his headquarters until after dawn. The timing of this war game proved catastrophically ill-fated for the German defense. Approximately half of all division commanders on the Cotentin Peninsula were absent from their posts when the American paratroopers began their descent. A quarter of all regimental commanders were similarly away. The war game had been scheduled to meticulously test German responses to an Allied invasion. Instead, it ensured that the actual invasion would encounter a critically decapitated command structure. Von Schlieb later wrote that he had departed for Rennes late on the afternoon of June 5th, accompanied by the commander of the 739th Grenadier Regiment. When the invasion began, they were miles from their respective divisions, utterly incapable of issuing orders, coordinating responses, or doing anything other than racing back through the Norman countryside, desperately hoping to reach their commands before it was too late. In Dollmann's absence, the 7th Army's Chief of Staff, General Major Max Pemsel, endeavored to make sense of the fragmented reports flooding in. Paratroopers had been sighted near Sainte-Mère-Église. Paratroopers had been reported south of Carentan. Paratroopers were supposedly landing near Montebourg, near Valognes, near dozens of other locations across the peninsula. Pemsel was convinced that this was the genuine invasion. He telephoned General Günther Blumentritt at OB West headquarters and vehemently insisted that Normandy represented the main Allied thrust. Blumentritt reported this assessment to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who summarily dismissed it. Normandy, von Rundstedt declared, was merely a feint. The true invasion would materialize at Calais. This profound disagreement at the highest echelons of German command paralyzed their response for critical hours. Pemsel was correct. Von Rundstedt was wrong. However, by the time the undeniable truth emerged, the Americans had already firmly established their foothold. The dummy paratroopers, known as Rhinelanders, deployed by the Allies, further compounded the confusion. These were small mannequins, weighted and equipped with parachutes, designed to divert German attention away from the actual drop zones. Upon impact, explosive charges simulated gunfire. German units wasted precious hours responding to these phantom threats. By the time Pemsel fully comprehended that the primary American effort was concentrated on the eastern flank of the Cotentin Peninsula, it was too late to mount an effective counteroffensive. The paratroopers had already seized key strategic positions, and the beach landings had commenced. The German defensive plan lay in ruins. The failure of German command and control on D-Day was not merely a matter of unfortunate coincidence. It was the direct consequence of a deliberate American strategy, albeit not entirely the one originally conceived. The planners of the airborne operation had intended for paratroopers to land in concentrated units, secure specific objectives, and hold them until relieved by forces arriving from the beaches. The widespread scatter drops that actually occurred were considered a failure at the time, yet the resulting chaos served American objectives, even if it was not by design. The German military was structured to react to identified threats in specific locations. When threats materialized simultaneously across a broad front, the response mechanism faltered. First Lieutenant Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, landed in a field near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont at approximately 1:20 hours. Like most paratroopers that night, he found himself alone and disoriented. Winters, 26 years old, was a farm boy from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, with no prior combat experience. The aircraft carrying his company commander and the majority of the company headquarters staff had been shot down. Every officer senior to Winters in Easy Company was either deceased or unaccounted for. Within hours, Winters would lead one of the most celebrated small unit actions of the entire war. By dawn, Winters had managed to rally approximately a dozen men from various units. His battalion commander ordered him to neutralize a German artillery battery that was bombarding Utah Beach. The battery was situated at a location known as Brecourt Manor, approximately 300 meters from the American assembly point. Winters conducted a swift reconnaissance, discovering 4 German 105mm howitzers connected by a trench system and defended by approximately 60 soldiers, supported by multiple machine gun emplacements. He commanded a force of 12 men. Winters strategically divided his meager contingent into assault and support elements, positioning machine guns to provide covering fire. He dispatched 3 men to flank the initial gun position with grenades, and then personally led the charge down the trench line. The assault was executed with textbook precision, a manual being written in real time. Winters and his men captured the first gun, then the second, and subsequently the third. Reinforcements arrived from Dog Company under the command of 2nd Lieutenant Ronald Spires. Together, they succeeded in taking the 4th gun. By the conclusion of the engagement, approximately 23 men had participated. The entire operation lasted roughly 3 hours. Winters' group neutralized 15 German soldiers, wounded numerous others, and captured a map detailing the locations of all German artillery positions on the Cotentin Peninsula. This map would prove invaluable to American forces. The suppression of the artillery battery enabled troops landing at Utah Beach to advance inland with significantly fewer casualties than might otherwise have been sustained. Winters was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but received the Distinguished Service Cross instead, a consequence of a policy limiting Medal of Honor awards to one per division for the invasion. What rendered the engagement at Bricourt Manor significant was not solely its tactical success, but the manner in which Winters adapted to seemingly insurmountable circumstances. He lacked heavy weaponry, air support, and any numerical superiority. He commanded a handful of men, most of whom he had never previously worked with, and yet he attacked with unwavering resolve. This aggressive spirit manifested repeatedly across the Cotentin Peninsula on June 6th. Small groups of American paratroopers, cut off from their units and leaders, did not seek cover and await rescue. They attacked. In the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, paratroopers from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment seized control before dawn. This town marked the first locality in France liberated by American forces. The assault was not a product of coordination or elaborate planning. It occurred because individual soldiers identified an opportunity and seized it. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss led a small contingent into the town center at approximately 400 hours. His men had landed dispersed throughout the surrounding area, many having lost their equipment bundles, some armed only with pistols and knives. Despite these handicaps, they captured the town. German defenders were killed or apprehended before they could organize any resistance. The swastika flag was lowered from the town hall, and an American flag, carried folded inside a sergeant's jump jacket, was raised in its place. This was not how invasions were conventionally expected to unfold. An invasion typically required meticulous preparation, a concentration of force, and overwhelming firepower. Sainte-Mère-Église fell to a small group of men who acted decisively before the enemy could comprehend their intentions. Similar scenarios unfolded across the Norman countryside that night. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment led an assault on a series of German barracks buildings near the village of Messy. He had been tasked with clearing the buildings with a small squad of 15 men. When the majority of his men hesitated, Summers advanced alone, accompanied only by Private William Burt, providing machine gun support, and Private John Champagnon joining the assault. Summers kicked open the first door and eliminated all occupants with his submachine gun. He then proceeded to the next building and the next. For 5 hours, Summers systematically fought his way through the German position, clearing building by building, room by room. By the time he completed his mission, Summers had personally killed over 30 German soldiers. His commanding officer recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Like Winters, he received a lesser decoration. The accounts of individual heroism from D-Day could fill volumes. Each paratrooper who jumped that night possesses a story, most of which will remain untold, their narrators having departed and taken their memories with them. What endures is the cumulative record, a consistent testament to men who refuse to accept their circumstances as hopeless. The German officer corps had been trained to anticipate rational behavior from their adversaries. An outnumbered force, they believed, should prioritize self-preservation. A scattered force should consolidate before engaging. An isolated force should defend until relieved. The Americans, however, did none of these things. Major Friedrich von Dye experienced his own encounter with American aggression beginning on June 6th. Von Dye commanded the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, one of the most elite units within the German army. His paratroopers were veterans of Crete, North Africa, and the Eastern Front, among the most proficient soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Von Dye had positioned his regiment to defend Carentan, a critical crossroads town that linked the American landing beaches at Utah and Omaha. Control of Carentan meant control of the vital link between the two American beachheads. His regiment earned a grim distinction that night. They were the first German unit to identify enemy soldiers landing in Normandy, specifically the pathfinders of the 101st Airborne Division, who landed between Assouville and Carentan at 6 o'clock in the morning on June 6th. Vandaille personally interrogated captured American pathfinders in Carentan. He was struck by their distinctive appearance. Many had shaved their heads into mohawk cuts and painted their faces for battle. Vandaille reportedly remarked to his staff, "Now they are sending us their Indians." The captured Americans conveyed a message to Vandaille that would prove prophetic. They claimed that German forces believed there were approximately 10 times more enemy soldiers on the peninsula than there actually were. The scattered landings had effectively generated an illusion of overwhelming force. Vandaille anticipated that the Americans would dedicate several days to consolidating their dispersed units before launching any significant offensive operations. The Americans, however, attacked on June 10th, just 4 days after the initial landings. The assault on Carentan evolved into one of the most fiercely contested battles of the entire Normandy campaign. American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division advanced along exposed causeways under relentless German fire. They traversed flooded fields, wading through water up to their waists, and fought street by street, house by house through the town. Vandaille later wrote about his adversaries with evident respect. He observed their readiness to sustain losses, their unwavering resolve under fire, and their bold maneuvers even when outnumbered. The Americans who faced his regiment bestowed upon them a distinctive appellation, the Lions of Carentan. During one notable juncture of the engagement, the Americans proposed a 2-hour cessation of hostilities at midday on June the 11th to facilitate the retrieval of their fallen and injured. General Maxwell Taylor, commanding the 101st Airborne, seized this opportunity to transmit a surrender summons to Vandaille. Vandaille, however, had received explicit directives from Field Marshal Win Rammel to defend Carentan at any price. Consequently, capitulation was not an option, even if he had desired it, though his ammunition reserves were dwindling. His regiment had endured grievous casualties, and the American forces continued their relentless advance. Upon receipt of Taylor's demand, Captain Rolf Mara of the 2nd Battalion responded in English with a pointed inquiry. Would you surrender in the same predicament? The prolonged struggle in the vicinity of Carentan had already exacted a heavy toll on Vanderhade's regiment. Lieutenant Colonel Emile Prachat, leading the 1st Battalion, had spearheaded assaults against the 101st Airborne at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. By the evening of June the 7th, Prachat's contingent was severely depleted, with the majority of his soldiers wounded and incapacitated. They consequently accepted an offer of surrender extended by Colonel Howard Johnson of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. A mere 25 men managed to escape and reach Carentan. These elite German paratroopers were being systematically annihilated by American paratroopers who had been engaged in combat for less than 48 hours. On June the 12th, Colonel Fondonder instructed his remaining troops to execute a nocturnal withdrawal from Carentan. Hostilities persisted through a German counteroffensive on June the 13th, before the town ultimately fell definitively into American hands on June the 14th. The capture of Carentan served to connect the Utah and Omaha beachheads, thereby solidifying the American lodgment in Normandy. Fondate's elite paratroopers had been repelled by combatants who had less than a week of operational experience. The German 7th Army meticulously documented the events of the Normandy campaign. These records encompassed post-operation evaluations, intelligence summaries, and the personal accounts of officers across all echelons of command. These documents illuminate a military apparatus struggling to comprehend an adversary that defied conventional expectations. German intelligence officers meticulously compiled analyses of American battlefield techniques. They scrutinized captured documents and conducted interrogations of prisoners. Their objective was to discern patterns that might enable the prediction of American actions, an endeavor in which they largely faltered. A German report dated June the 20th, 1944, known as the von Rundstedt Report, designation 50-50-44, endeavored to synthesize the unfolding events. The document noted that only within the American bridgehead north of Carrington were the enemy airborne units constrained towards the coastal defenses following prolonged and arduous fighting. The very phrasing of this observation betrayed the Germans' palpable frustration. They had anticipated a swift defeat of the paratroopers, yet found themselves engaged in days of combat merely to contain them. The American paratroopers did not adhere to predictable methodologies because their objective was not pattern adherence, but rather the accomplishment of their missions. When one approach proved ineffective, they readily adopted another. As circumstances evolved, they demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Their actions were driven by objectives rather than rigid procedures. This goal-oriented modus operandi was intrinsically ingrained in American soldiery, a product of their upbringing. The prevailing culture in America during the 1930s and 40s fostered a pragmatic approach to problem solving. Those who would become paratroopers had matured by engaging with machinery, devising improvised solutions, and independently figuring things out. They brought this inventive spirit to warfare, a trait that profoundly bewildered their German adversaries. Recurring themes emerge in German communiqué concerning American paratroopers. The descriptor aggressive appears with striking frequency. German officers remarked on the Americans' propensity to attack when any rational assessment would have dictated a defensive posture. They undertook risks that seemed audacious, pressing forward despite losses that would have compelled other formations to withdraw. The term unpredictable is employed with nearly equal regularity. German intelligence officers expressed dismay that American paratrooper units disregarded conventional military principles. They did not await logistical support, nor did they pause to consolidate their gains. They appeared indifferent to being outnumbered or surrounded. Perhaps most significantly, German reports highlighted the caliber of American junior leadership. Within the Wehrmacht, directives emanated from superior echelons downwards. Officers issued commands, and soldiers executed them. Initiative at subordinate levels was generally discouraged. American paratroopers, however, operated under a contrasting paradigm. When officers were casualties or separated from their units, sergeants assumed command. In the absence of sergeants, corporals stepped into leadership roles. Even privates made tactical decisions that, in the German army, would have necessitated authorization from officers of considerably higher rank. This decentralized command structure confounded the German defenders. They were unable to neutralize American units by eliminating their officers, as the formations persisted in combat under the leadership of whoever remained capable of commanding. Captain Jager Erwin Schmeiger, who served with the 9th Parachute Regiment during the Normandy campaign, recounted in a post-war interview documented by military historian Gilberto Villaosa his encounters with American troops in proximity to Hill 192, near the town of St. Lo. Schmeiger characterized his adversaries as madmen. He specifically referenced soldiers of the 2nd Infantry Division, identifiable by the Indian head insignia adorning their shoulders, though his assessment could have been applied to any of the American units engaged in combat in Normandy that summer. Schmeiger vividly recalled one particular night. German paratroopers held defensive positions along the periphery of a woodland, with each soldier occupying a foxhole approximately 50 meters apart. They could discern the movement of Americans in the darkness. There was an eerie silence. No gunfire, no artillery, only the stealthy rustling of men advancing through the undergrowth. Suddenly, Schmeiger heard a scream. A German soldier in an adjacent foxhole had been dispatched silently, his throat cut. Schmeiger remained in his foxhole for the remainder of the night, gripped by fear, utterly incapable of identifying his unseen assailant. He was acutely aware that the Americans were present somewhere in the enveloping darkness, waiting. This represented psychological warfare of the most rudimentary, yet profoundly effective nature. The Americans had adopted the tactics of hunters, moving under the cloak of night, employing silent kills whenever feasible, and utilizing the very terrain that the Germans believed offered them sanctuary as cover for their own clandestine infiltrations. Schmeiger survived the war, a distinction not shared by many of his comrades. The dispersed airborne insertions on June the 6th were initially deemed a failure by American strategists. The casualty figures were substantial, and most units landed significantly off course from their designated objectives. The intricate plans meticulously formulated over months of preparation became obsolete within moments of the initial parachuting. However, the German perspective revealed a different interpretation. They observed an enemy capable of transforming adversity into a strategic advantage. The scattered drops generated confusion not only for the Americans, but also for the German defense forces. The defenders found it impossible to pinpoint the primary threat, as no singular threat existed. Instead, hundreds of minor threats materialized simultaneously across their lines. German reserves, which should have been deployed to counter the beach landings, were instead occupied pursuing phantom paratroopers through the Norman hedgerows. Units designated to reinforce coastal defenses were embroiled in desperate skirmishes within their own rear areas. The entire German defensive framework was thus disrupted, not by a concentrated assault, but by a multitude of seemingly insignificant actions that collectively weakened the defense. By the close of June the 6th, the American airborne divisions had sustained an estimated 2,500 casualties. Yet, they had achieved a crucial objective that no amount of planning could have guaranteed. They had effectively paralyzed the German response at the most critical juncture of the invasion. The ensuing days following June the 6th witnessed even more ferocious combat. The Norman hedgerows, ancient earthen ramparts crowned with dense vegetation, transformed every parcel of land into a potential stronghold. German defenders leveraged these natural fortifications to impede the American advance to a glacial pace. The paratroopers, who had survived the initial descent, now confronted a drastically altered form of warfare. This was no longer the fluid, mobile combat of airborne operations. It devolved into a grinding, brutal engagement measured in yards, not miles. The hedgerow fighting subjected American soldiers to trials for which their training had provided no adequate preparation. Visibility was reduced to mere feet, with enemy combatants concealed behind earthen walls mere meters away. Every forward movement demanded the systematic clearing of fields, frequently at immense human cost. The German defenders fought with exceptional skill and unwavering resolve. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, seasoned by years of conflict against the Soviets. They possessed an intimate understanding of terrain utilization, excelled at orchestrating ambushes, and were adept at inflicting substantial casualties for every incremental gain of ground. Nevertheless, the American paratroopers demonstrated remarkable adaptability. They devised novel tactics specifically for hedgerow combat. They learned to coordinate their efforts with armored units, employing explosives to breach the earthen barriers. They mastered the synchronization of artillery barrages with infantry assaults and developed proficiency in nocturnal movements, infiltrating German positions under the cover of darkness. German officers who confronted them noted this evolving capability with considerable apprehension. The American soldiers they encountered in late June were demonstrably different from those who had landed on June the 6th. They were hardened, more experienced, and significantly more formidable. The German military did not forget the crucial lessons learned in Normandy, nor did the American paratroopers. When Hitler initiated his final major offensive in the West in December of 1944, the German assault carved a substantial salient into the American lines in the Ardennes region of Belgium. German panzer divisions advanced rapidly toward the strategically vital crossroads town of Bastogne. In response, the Americans hastily deployed the 101st Airborne Division to defend the town. These were, in large part, the same individuals who had parachuted into Normandy 6 months prior. They arrived in Bastogne on December the 19th, mere hours before German forces completely encircled the town. For the subsequent week, the paratroopers held Bastogne against the full might of the German onslaught. They endured frigid temperatures, operating with severely limited supplies of ammunition, food, and medical provisions. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely isolated from any hope of reinforcement. On December the 22nd, German officers approached the American positions under a flag of truce, bearing a surrender ultimatum for the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. As acting commander of the 101st Airborne, McAuliffe delivered a terse, one-word response: nuts. The German officers, unfamiliar with this American idiom, sought clarification. An American colonel promptly elucidated. The general's answer was a definitive no. The Germans departed, and the bombardment resumed with renewed intensity as the paratroopers continued their tenacious defense. 4 days later, armored units from General George Patton's Third Army pierced the German encirclement, liberating the besieged town. The bulge was contained, the German offensive faltered, and the 101st Airborne added another legendary chapter to its annals. The German soldiers who survived the Battle of the Bulge would later articulate their experiences facing the American paratroopers at Bastogne with the same admixture of frustration and profound respect that their predecessors had expressed following the Normandy campaign. These were not individuals who adhered to conventional military calculations. They were men who resolutely refused to yield, irrespective of the overwhelming odds. The establishment of American airborne forces had been a contentious undertaking from its inception. In 1940, the United States Army possessed no paratrooper units. The concept of vertical envelopment, the deployment of soldiers behind enemy lines via parachute, had been pioneered by the Soviets during the 1930s. The Germans had subsequently employed airborne formations with remarkable efficacy in their conquests of Norway, the Low Countries, and Crete. American military leadership observed these developments with keen interest, albeit tinged with skepticism. Airborne operations were inherently costly. The training of paratroopers demanded specialized equipment and substantial time investments. The casualty rates associated with combat jumps were alarmingly high. Many senior officers questioned whether the perceived advantages outweighed the considerable expenses. General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, held a contrary view. He sanctioned the formation of a test platoon at Fort Benning, Georgia. In June of 1940, this platoon comprised 50 volunteers drawn from the 29th Infantry Regiment. On August the 16th, 1940, Lieutenant William Ryder achieved the distinction of being the first American officer to execute an official military parachute jump. Private William King holds the record as the first enlisted man to make such a jump, according to accounts from that era, solely because the soldier preceding him in line declined to proceed. Thus commenced the parachute era of the American military. What ensued was one of the most rigorous training programs in military history. Paratrooper candidates were pushed to the extreme limits of their physical and psychological endurance. They engaged in daily runs covering extensive distances. They practiced hand-to-hand combat techniques and learned to meticulously pack their own parachutes, fully cognizant that a single error could prove fatal. The training proceeded at an unforgiving pace. Candidates completed a 3-week course that condensed months of standard infantry instruction into 21 days of relentless physical and mental exertion. Each day commenced well before dawn, with runs that progressively increased in length. 5 miles evolved into 10, and 10 miles stretched to 20. The iconic towers at Fort Benning, standing 250 feet tall, served to simulate the sensation of a parachute descent. Individuals were hoisted to the apex, attached to a parachute harness, and then released. This experience imparted vital lessons in managing the shock of parachute deployment and executing landings without sustaining fractures. A considerable number of candidates failed to complete the program. The stringent physical requirements eliminated those incapable of enduring the relentless tempo, while the psychological demands weeded out individuals unable to conquer their phobias of heights, jumping, and the inherent uncertainties of the unknown. Those who persevered cultivated an esprit de corps unparalleled within the American military. They were outfitted with distinctive boots, received supplementary pay, and earned the coveted silver wings of qualified paratroopers only after successfully completing 5 jumps. The men who navigated this arduous training developed a sense of superiority that bordered on outright arrogance. They perceived themselves as the finest soldiers in the entire army. They regarded regular infantrymen with disdain, labeling them legs, lesser beings incapable of meeting the exacting standards set for paratroopers. This inherent pride served a crucial purpose. Soldiers who believed themselves to be elite fought with the valor and effectiveness characteristic of elite units. The training fostered not only physical prowess, but also a profound psychological confidence that would prove indispensable in combat. By June of 1944, the American Airborne Force had expanded from a modest 50-man test platoon to 5 full divisions. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had already gained combat experience in Sicily and Italy. They possessed a clear understanding of what awaited them in France. Many of them would not survive the ordeal, yet they jumped nonetheless. The German military conducted extensive analyses of American paratrooper tactics in the aftermath of Normandy. Intelligence officers compiled comprehensive reports, and commanders engaged in thorough discussions of lessons learned. The Wehrmacht adapted its defensive strategies to counter potential future airborne operations. However, there remained a singular element of American paratrooper effectiveness that the Germans were unable to replicate or effectively counter. It was neither a weapon nor a specific tactic, but rather a distinct mindset. American military culture during World War II emphasized individual initiative in ways that diverged significantly from German cultural norms. American soldiers were expected to exercise independent judgment when circumstances necessitated it. They were trained to achieve objectives, not merely to execute orders. This fundamental difference became critically important in airborne operations, where the inherent chaos of combat jumps routinely resulted in the separation of men from their leaders and units from their meticulously crafted plans. German soldiers facing similar circumstances often found themselves awaiting orders that never arrived. American soldiers, conversely, improvised. The German term for this crucial quality was Auftragstaktik, or mission-oriented tactics. Ironically, German military theorists had been the initial pioneers of this approach in the 19th century. However, by World War II, the German army had become increasingly rigid and centralized under Hitler's authoritarian control. The Americans, without explicit knowledge of the German terminology, embraced this theoretical framework and applied it with a dynamism that surpassed even its originators. Friedrich von der survived the war. He was taken prisoner during the Battle of the Bulge following the failure of a German paratrooper operation he had led behind American lines. He subsequently served in the West German Army during the Cold War and pursued a career as a professor of political science. In 1948, while interned at the Allenroth prisoner of war camp, von der meticulously chronicled his regiment's operations for the United States Army Historical Division. This document, designated as Foreign Military Studies Manuscript B839, remains one of the most vital German primary sources detailing the Normandy campaign. Within this account, von der reflected on his combat experiences against American paratroopers. He acknowledged their courage and tactical flexibility, admitting that they had repeatedly surprised him. Von der had anticipated that the Americans would fight according to European military conventions, adhering to the same logical frameworks, employing similar calculations of risk and reward, and making the same rational assessments of feasibility and folly that he himself utilized. The Americans, however, consistently defied these expectations. They attacked when they ought to have defended, advanced when they should have retreated, fought as individuals when their units fragmented, and rallied as cohesive formations when their leaders fell. They possessed an unyielding tenacity. Von der was a man of considerable intellect and spent significant time after the war analyzing his wartime experiences. He concluded that the American approach to warfare fundamentally differed from the established European tradition. European armies, including his own, regarded war as a science governed by principles, calculations, and established rules, where victory belonged to the force that most effectively applied these tenets. The Americans, conversely, treated war as a problem demanding a solution. When one method proved unsuccessful, they promptly explored alternatives. When their leaders perished, new leaders invariably emerged. When their plans disintegrated, they formulated new ones with alacrity. Their practicality was so pronounced that it seemed almost imprudent to professionally trained officers. Yet, this very practicality, this inherent willingness to improvise, conferred upon them an advantage that no amount of specialized training or stringent discipline could match. They were unpredictable, and unpredictability itself is a formidable weapon. Von der's post-war writings profoundly influenced a generation of German military thinkers. His analysis of American tactics was studied in military academies across the globe. His assertion that American victory stemmed not solely from superior resources, but from a superior mindset, challenged long-held assumptions that had guided European military thought for centuries. This resolute refusal to concede defeat, this aggressive spirit that struck German observers as almost irrational, was not something that could be instilled in military academies. Its origins lay far deeper. Perhaps it stemmed from the voluntary nature of airborne service. Every American paratrooper had actively chosen their path. They had volunteered for the Army, then volunteered again for airborne duty, and finally volunteered a third time for combat. These were men who actively sought out danger rather than evaded it. Perhaps it was a product of American culture itself. The soldiers who parachuted into Normandy had matured during the Great Depression, enduring hardship and developing resilience through direct experience. They cultivated an optimistic stubbornness that rejected perceived limitations. Or perhaps it was simply the profound understanding that they were fighting for a cause immeasurably worth dying for. The men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were acutely aware of the nature of the Nazi regime and the dire consequences for Europe should Hitler prevail. They plunged into the darkness, undeterred. In any event, the German officers who subsequently documented their encounters with American paratroopers were endeavoring to comprehend phenomena that defied their established categories. These were not soldiers universally equipped with the finest weaponry, nor were they always the most rigorously trained. They were certainly not the most numerous contingent. But these soldiers represented a phenomenon the German military had not previously encountered. They were Americans. They hailed from the agricultural heartland of Iowa and the bustling manufacturing centers of Detroit. Their origins spanned the rugged terrain of Appalachia and the vibrant streets of Brooklyn. They embodied the immense diversity of backgrounds and circumstances that a vast and varied nation could produce. And as they descended from the C-47 aircraft into the darkened skies over Normandy, they carried with them an unyielding force that no German bullet could extinguish, the absolute conviction that they would prevail. This unwavering belief, this fierce optimism in the face of overwhelming odds, was precisely what German officers discerned and documented in their reports. It was the palpable sentiment felt by Schmege as he shivered in his foxhole, anticipating the arrival of the Americans in the gloom. It was the reality confronted by van der Heide at Currenton, where his seasoned paratroopers were repulsed by men with no prior combat experience before D-Day. The German term for this might have been Kampfgeist, a fighting spirit. The American designation was far more straightforward: guts. The enduring legacy of the American paratroopers who served in World War II extends far beyond their battlefield accomplishments. The 82nd Airborne Division has maintained its active service status without interruption from 1942 to the present day. It has been deployed in every significant American military engagement since Normandy. Its soldiers have parachuted into conflict zones in Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The 101st Airborne Division underwent a transformation into an air assault unit during the 1970s. It continues to be one of the most frequently deployed divisions within the American Army. The iconic Screaming Eagle insignia, worn by soldiers at Utah Beach in 1944, remains the emblem of soldiers serving around the globe today. More crucially, the paratroopers of World War II established a tradition of aggressive, adaptable, and mission-focused warfare that continues to shape American military doctrine. The strategic lessons learned at Boer Manor are still imparted at West Point. The indomitable spirit that secured Carentan is still ingrained in every soldier who earns the coveted parachutist badge. The German officers who harbored apprehension towards the American paratroopers were entirely justified in their fear. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were volunteers who had endured rigorous and demanding training to merit the distinction of leaping from aircraft into the crucible of combat. They were men who accepted that their missions would frequently necessitate fighting outnumbered, surrounded, and cut off from any possibility of reinforcement. They were men who placed their trust in themselves and in one another, and this profound belief rendered them formidable in ways that the German military apparatus could neither anticipate nor counteract. When historians reflect upon the Normandy invasion, their focus often gravitates towards the sheer magnitude of the operation. The armada of thousands of vessels, the hundreds of thousands of troops deployed, the elaborate stratagems of deception, and the meticulous logistical preparations. These elements were undeniably vital. Without them, the invasion could not have succeeded. However, the invasion also triumphed due to the daring act of 13,000 young Americans who parachuted from aircraft in the dead of night into an unknown land to confront an enemy they had never faced, with no assurance of survival until sunrise. The precise figures have been meticulously recorded. The 101st Airborne Division dispatched 6,928 paratroopers, airborne aboard 432 C-47 transport aircraft. The 82nd Airborne Division sent 6,420 men aboard 369 aircraft. Collectively, this represented the largest airborne assault in history up to that point. By the conclusion of June 6th, they had sustained approximately 2,499 casualties. 182 men of the 101st were confirmed fatalities, while 156 men of the 82nd perished. Hundreds more sustained injuries, and hundreds more were reported missing, their ultimate fates unknown. They jumped because they believed it was an imperative act. They fought because they refused to countenance defeat. They achieved victory because they embodied precisely what the German officers feared most. They were American paratroopers, and on June 6, 1944, they fundamentally altered the course of the world. Decades after the cessation of hostilities, veterans of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions began returning to Normandy. They journeyed to pay respects at the graves of their fallen comrades. They walked the very ground where they had engaged in fierce combat. They came to be remembered by the people of Normandy, who had extended a warm welcome. The French had not forgotten the sacrifices made by the Americans. In communities such as Sainte-Mère-Église and Carentan, streets were named in honor of American servicemen. Memorials were erected. Every June, the American flag fluttered proudly alongside the French tricolor. These aging veterans were universally hailed as heroes. Children presented them with flowers, and adults grasped their hands in gratitude. The French people understood the immense price that had been paid to secure their liberation. Yet the veterans themselves often appeared discomfited by the label of hero. When questioned about their actions, they invariably deflected praise, attributing credit to their fellow soldiers, particularly those who did not survive. They seldom spoke of their own personal bravery. Dick Winters, who spearheaded the assault at Brecourt Manor, emerged as perhaps the most celebrated paratrooper of the war following the publication of Stephen Ambrose's seminal work, Band of Brothers, and its subsequent adaptation into an HBO series. He received numerous letters, requests for autographs, and was frequently addressed as a hero. Winters passed away in January 2011 at the venerable age of 92. In one of his final interviews, he contemplated the designation bestowed upon him by others. "I was not a hero," Winters stated. "The true heroes were the men who did not return." This characteristic humility was emblematic of the generation that fought in World War II. They did not perceive themselves as extraordinary individuals. Rather, they viewed themselves as ordinary people called upon to undertake an extraordinary duty. Perhaps therein lay the genesis of their remarkable strength. They did not believe they possessed unique qualities. They simply believed they had to accomplish what was necessary. The German officers who encountered them in Normandy might have been astonished to learn of the Americans' self-perception. The paratroopers who appeared so menacing, so aggressive, so seemingly invincible, were often fearful young men who pressed onward simply because they saw no other recourse. Their courage was authentic, but it was not the courage of those devoid of fear. It was the courage of men who experienced apprehension, yet acted regardless. It was the courage of individuals who confronted insurmountable odds and resolved to make an attempt. This particular brand of valor cannot be cultivated in training facilities. It cannot be commanded by generals. It can only arise from within the individuals themselves. The Germans recognized this quality. They feared it, and ultimately, they were overcome by it. The last surviving American paratroopers who participated in the D-Day jumps are now nearly all gone. The youngest among them would be approaching 100 years of age today. Each passing year, fewer remain to recount their experiences firsthand. Consequently, the historical record assumes paramount importance. The diaries and letters, the after-action reports and intelligence summaries, the photographs and films that endured the war, these now serve as our primary conduit to the events that transpired in those Norman fields in June 1944. The German accounts are of particular value as they provide a perspective that American narratives cannot fully capture. We understand what the paratroopers believed they were accomplishing. The German documents elucidate the actual impact they had. These documents consistently reveal a shared sentiment. The American paratroopers instilled terror in their adversaries. This was not due to their perfection as soldiers, but because of their relentless tenacity. It was not because they executed flawless operations, but because they persisted in combat when perfect plans unraveled. The inherent disarray of the Normandy landings should have resulted in a German victory. The scattered deployments, the lost equipment, the disrupted communications, the fallen officers, all these factors should have enabled the Wehrmacht to systematically defeat the airborne assault before the beach landings could consolidate. Instead, this chaos transformed into an American advantage. The very elements that should have overwhelmed the paratroopers became the catalysts for paralyzing the German response. This remarkable transformation of vulnerability into strength constitutes the central narrative of the American airborne experience in World War II. It occurred not as a result of superior planning or advanced equipment, but because of the men who jumped. They were farmers and factory workers, students and salesmen. They came from every corner of the nation and every imaginable background. Their sole shared characteristic was a readiness to volunteer for the most perilous mission in the American military. And upon their arrival in Normandy, when everything went awry, when plans crumbled and darkness enveloped them, they discovered within themselves a capacity for improvisation and aggression that no training regimen could have foreseen. The German officers who documented their observations after the war grappled with explaining something that defied simple categorization. How did ordinary men ascend to the status of extraordinary soldiers? How did dispersed units coalesce into an effective fighting force? How did chaos yield victory? The answers to these profound questions are not found in military handbooks. They reside within the human spirit. They are embodied in the determination that rejects capitulation, in the adaptability that unearths solutions when confronted by seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and in the courage that compels action when acting appears impossible. These exceptional qualities are not exclusive to any single nation. They manifest in soldiers of all nationalities during moments of profound crisis. However, in June 1944, across the fields and hedgerows of Normandy, American paratroopers demonstrated these virtues with a consistency that their German opponents had never encountered. The resultant victory profoundly altered the trajectory of the war and the course of history. If this narrative has resonated with you, please consider liking this video. Your engagement assists us in sharing more stories from the Second World War that merit remembrance. Subscribe to remain connected with these historical accounts. Activate the notification bell to ensure you never miss a new video upload. Kindly leave a comment below indicating your viewing location. Our global community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from London to Lagos. Whether you are a veteran, a student of history, or simply an individual who believes these stories hold significance, you are an integral part of something meaningful here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for diligently preserving the memory of these remarkable men.